Information regarding the UFO outbreak, as I continue to call it, the one that's at least mostly focused around the New Jersey and New York area, is becoming harder and harder to come by, mostly because, according to the mainstream media and especially the government, the crisis is largely over. And there are far fewer sightings and far fewer clips like this emerging online, at least clips that are easy to find. Also, there are unconfirmed reports that new footage that's being taken, especially in sensitive areas close to military facilities, are being taken down or banned or demonetized or whatever almost immediately after they're posted. Again, this is unconfirmed, and so far I haven't had any shadowy government agencies try to take my channel down or ban any of my content, but nevertheless, this trend definitely seems to correspond with the overall message from the government telling us that this was never a crisis to begin with, that these were legitimate drones in operation or aircraft or something else, and people just don't look up at the sky very often, and when they started looking up, they started seeing things that had always been there, but are now prone to being misidentified by untrained observers. But there is one big inconsistency in the government's narrative, and that is the fact that the FAA doesn't seem to believe that this crisis is over. As a matter of fact, they seem to be expanding their search area and taking even greater action to restrict the activities of legitimate drone operators as they continue their investigation. And in my opinion, they still have quite a lot to investigate, because there's a significant difference between a drone sighting and an orb UAP, such as the ones that you're looking at right now. And the reason I believe that is this is not the first time we have seen objects like this. Indeed, these sorts of objects were spotted by the U.S. Air Force 70 years ago, long before any drones were flying through American skies. So as just about all of us probably know at this point, the government is insisting that whatever all of these sightings have been in the New Jersey, New York area, which by the way have also extended all over the country and indeed even in other nations around the world, they aren't a threat to national security. But in spite of this, the FAA has taken even more extreme action than they were taking before. At first, the FAA had implemented a drone exclusion zone to 22 districts in New Jersey, but now that has extended to another 9, and there are new clips emerging from counties like Somerset, New Jersey, Ocean, and Bergen. Public fascination has not gone away. But in spite of the increased controls and increased oversight, officials continue to stand firm that there's no national security or safety peril. National Security Councilman John Kirby asserted, quote, "We have not identified anything anomalous or any national security or public safety risk over the civilian airspace in New Jersey or other states in the Northeast." However, not everybody in a position of authority agrees with this assessment. According to Ocean County Sheriff Michael Mastronardi, he reported that his officers used their drone, a police pursuit drone, to chase a group of mysterious aircraft, quote, "coming off the ocean," unquote, after being spotted by a deputy. But the industrial-grade drone could not keep up with the faster objects. Consequently, authorities in Ocean County sought an emergency declaration back in December to allow for federal assistance in dealing with these drone incidents. This period, however, saw heightened activity despite the new restrictions. Now, New Jersey Congressman Jeff Van Drew told reporters that his high-clearance U.S. government sources have confirmed fears that these drones could be foreign surveillance devices. He expressed alarm, saying, quote, "Something's very wrong. noting the drone's ability to travel undetected even though they're the size of minivans and fly through radar-blind zones. Again, I really question the foreign agent explanation, though. Why would a foreign agent make their drones so obvious in the night sky? We are essentially looking at the equivalent of extra bright landing lights on drones that are supposed to be keeping an eye on the United States covertly. It just doesn't make a great deal of sense to me. But the congressman had more to say about the unsettling nature of the situation. Quote, "We've got unidentifiable, sophisticated drones as big as minivans carefully navigating airspace that's not covered by radar in a very important part of our country, and still a month later we somehow don't know anything." Vandrew also criticized the tranquilizing responses from the government, stressing, "We're being told, don't worry, everything's okay." Monmouth County Sheriff Sean Golden raised the alarm over public safety due to a spike in nocturnal drone activity as well. Quote, "Residents are increasingly alarmed by the surge in drone activity after dark, raising concerns about public safety and security." He urged immediate action, stating, "We cannot wait any longer. The governor must act now, and the Air National Guard needs to step in to protect our communities." Doesn't sound like the situation is over, not by a long shot. Now, skeptics often point to commercial drones and some of the spectacular things that these drones can do, especially if they are pre-programmed, as an easy and logical explanation for everything that we're seeing right now. However, I think that there's some very big inconsistencies with that theory. First of all, commercial drones don't carry these very bright strobe-like lights that we've been seeing in these types of sightings. As a matter of fact, I saw commercial drones while I was observing activity at RAF Lakenheath, but I also saw orb UAPs. And let me tell you, there's a huge difference between the two. And there's another important thing to consider about commercial drones. No matter how sophisticated they are, they're not infallible, as you can see from this botched demonstration that was carried out in Orlando, Florida. As a matter of fact, a couple of these plunging drones struck observers on the ground, and yet out of all of the hundreds of sightings that have been made in the New York, New Jersey area, and of all the thousands of witnesses that have observed these strange objects in our night skies, none of them appear to have crashed, none of them have been recovered, and not a single drone operator has been apprehended. And not only that, this isn't the first time that we've had these types of outbreaks in this region of the country. The so-called Hudson Valley Flap, just a few hours north of this region, made a very big splash in the early 1980s. On New Year's Eve of 1982, a retired police officer in this region reported seeing a huge V-shaped object with multiple colored lights gliding almost silently over his property, and he wouldn't be the last person to report such an event. Many others followed, and by March 23rd of 1983, the local newspaper in Port Chester, New York, was running a front-page feature describing crowds of people claiming to have seen the triangular object. The witnesses who were interviewed included an on-duty police officer named Kevin Soravia, who testified that he had seen the object twice in a 45-minute period after his department had received more than 100 calls. He described the object the same way the others had, saying that he had seen it stop in mid-air and turn perpendicular before reversing course and heading away from view. At no point in the article was there any suggestion of people making up stories or misidentifying something. And by November of that year, the local newspapers were not just covering the sightings themselves, but also the people who were flocking to the valley to investigate this activity. On November 11th, the Journal News in White Plains, New York, ran a 2-column story featuring interviews with UFO investigators. One ufologist from Connecticut, who was a member of Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, told a reporter that more aliens would probably visit Earth if humans weren't so hostile towards them. A second investigator accused the federal government of having crashed flying discs and alien bodies, insisting that they were covering up the information to keep it from the public. The paper even included comments from J. Allen Hynek, probably the most famous UFO investigator back in the 70s and 80s, who described how and why he left his capacity as a science advisor to Project Blue Book. Hynek also said that researchers were fighting a publicity war with the military because military officials sought to ridicule anybody who reported a sighting. The sightings continued until well into the following year. But by this time, predictably, journalists had spread out to explore other possible explanations not involving extraterrestrials. And on June 28th of 1984, the Poughkeepsie Journal posted a feature in which they spoke to witnesses who were accusing stunt pilots with small aircraft of flying over the region in a close V-shaped formation to trick people into thinking that they were seeing something otherworldly. They even spoke to a police officer who claimed to have followed the planes back to a local airport and spoken to one of the pilots who admitted to pulling off the hoax. However, the pilots were never named, and also the paper made a point of including rebuttals from other witnesses who pointed out that they could easily identify a group of planes flying in formation, and added that no set of pilots could account for the numerous sightings that had been reported. And incidentally, stunt pilots fly over my house here in Britain on a pretty regular basis, and you can hear the engines. It's very obvious, especially they have to gun the engines when they're going to pull off a particular stunt. And so even though the hoax explanation has been largely debunked, no further effort was made to investigate what went on in Hudson Valley in the early 1980s until it was largely forgotten. Although not completely forgotten, because a UFO museum cropped up there a few years after these incidents and remains there up to this day. But at least we seem to have the entire phenomenon being taken a lot more seriously today, just as it was in the 1950s and 60s when Project Blue Book was getting started. And in those days, the footage that they captured was not all that dissimilar from what we're seeing today. Again, these orb-like objects being pursued by military aircraft or being filmed by military observers on the ground. And as you can see, they bear a great deal of resemblance to the orbs that are being observed and filmed in our skies today, except back in the 1950s and 60s, there were no drones. Matter of fact, there were very few aircraft of any kind that could masquerade as an orb UFO. And by the way, this footage was only recently made public by the Pentagon. Very strange coincidence that in the midst of telling us that there's nothing significant going on, that the Pentagon would dig all this stuff out of the National Archives and make it available to the public. But one thing that they're not making available to the public is a couple of CIA files from 1956, items that are, quote, an edited production featuring footage of unidentified flying objects from both Montana and Utah. Captions included at the beginning and the end of the film maintain that the footage was authentic and that the footage was studied by the Photo Reconnaissance Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and the U.S. Navy Photo Interpretation Center in Washington, D.C., adding that the staff were unable to identify the objects. I have been waiting now for close to 2 years for the National Archives to make this available to the public, and they still haven't. So here's my take on all of this. This is not something that's a phenomena of today's technology that people just happen to be noticing at the moment. This is instead an outbreak that's similar to other outbreaks of similar objects that we have seen in the past. Granted, 95% or even more of these sightings are mundane objects like this one, even though there are quite a number of people who continue to insist that this is not an aircraft. I don't see how this can't be an aircraft, but nevertheless, in spite of the fact that the majority of the sightings that people have been making lately are indeed mundane objects that they may not have noticed in the past, there is a substantial percentage of these objects that bear a greater similarity to things that have been seen 40, 50, 70 years ago rather than recently and cannot be explained by modern technology, and it is for this reason that the FAA is taking this situation so seriously and expanding their search area while simultaneously telling us that all is well. Thank you very much for watching, and thanks especially to new Patreon members David Bullard, Michael Maxey, and Johnny Fonseca. Keep in mind, we have a contest going on right now whereby I am giving away 2 pieces of the Starship launch facility at Boca Chica. One of them I'm giving away to a Patreon subscriber. The other I'm giving away to folks who support the channel with super thanks. And by the way, I've only gotten 3 super thanks donations so far this month, meaning that your odds of getting one of these pieces of spaceflight history are pretty darn good if you decide to support me that way. And if you're already a Patreon supporter, you've already been entered into that contest. And I'd really like to thank everybody who's supporting me right now, because January is a terrible time for content creators. It's the time that Google just pulls the rug out from under us when it comes to monetization and ad revenue. So once again, thanks so much for all that you do. And until the government gives us a legitimate explanation for what's going on in our skies, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.